This is a topic that it's clearly, you have to be in the right frame of your, transition to appreciate. And as we get through it, I think you'll see, as we get closer and closer to retirement and then into retirement, the decisions changed. And one of the things, because we've worked with so many people who've gone through this process, we've kind of realized it's not just an event. Retirement really is a transition period. So that's the thought process behind today's, 10-year retirement countdown. You could call it countdown, you could call it roadmap, you could call it a lot of different things. But most people, spend 30, 40 years saving for retirement, with the thought process that it's just out there someday. But it really isn't just a savings event, and it's not something that just happens. Well, if it's done right, it's not something that just happens. And so as we get closer and closer to retirement, priorities change, situations change. And so what we normally see is 10 years out is really when people start to get a little bit nervous and a little bit more anxious about how the planning of retirement will go. So it's a lot easier to put retirement off when you're still 20 years out or 30 years out. But once you get to where it's within sight, and 10 years is kind of that point where a lot of people are really starting to think about what life is going to look like post-work. That's kind of the thought process behind 10 years. And so this is the timeline that we're planning on kind of going through, which, you go 10 years, 8 years, 5 years, and you can kind of see the themes that build out amongst them. So we're building the foundation, we're protecting the plan, we're testing the plan, we're practicing, we're doing a lot of different things in each one of these time frames that can make a big difference to having a successful retirement. So kind of starting 10 years out. And I know, not everybody is 10 years out, but we're looking at what that would be. And at 10 years, you still have a tremendous amount of flexibility. You've got a lot of time to make up for either, inabilities to put money aside or unexpected expenses that have drained, but you still have a lot of flexibility. But it's a really good time to start thinking about what retirement should look like for you. And to me, there's two different ways of looking at that. And that would be, one, how much money do I want to have in retirement? That's kind of where we come into the picture a lot of times. But the other is, what does retirement actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, what do I want retirement days to look like? I'm going to get up, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. I'm going to, garden. I'm going to go play golf. I'm going to visit with family. I'm going to do those type of things. And so a lot of times when we'll ask people, what does retirement look to you? It's much more so that they have an idea of what the vision of retirement looks like, more so than, hey, I need this much money. There are rules of thumb that come into play. A lot of times, the biggest thing that we will tell people is that 80% of your take-home pay is what most people kind of target in retirement. And there's some reasons for that. You're no longer paying payroll taxes, so you no longer have to worry about that portion that's coming out of your retirement. You're no longer paying the same level of federal income tax because you don't have W-2 income coming in the same way. It's offset by Social Security, perhaps, that's not being taxed at the same level, or retirement distributions, which sometimes can come from Roth transactions. So that's not taxable. So 80% is a good rule of thumb. So in looking at what retirement would look like, you can take your salary today and say, all right, well, maybe I'm further than 10 years out, but I can predict what my wage growth is going to be over the next couple of years. And so at 10 years, you can say, all right, well, if my wages grew at 3% a year or 4% a year, by the time I retire, I'm hopefully going to be making X. And then you take 80% of that, and all of a sudden you've got a number that you can really start working around. And at 10 years, you've got the flexibility to say, I'm nowhere close to where I'm at, or I'm overfunded, or I'm right on track. And so you can start putting more money away. You can take the foot off the gas pedal, but that flexibility is the big hallmark of 10 years. The other thing that we talk about at 10 years is for your existing retirement savings that you already have, you still have the ability to have a decent amount of growth within your portfolio. So a lot of times when we get to that point, you think, well, I need all this money to be completely safe by the time I retire. And if completely safe means CDs earning 3% or, right now we're at 4% for CDs, that may not get you there. So having the ability to still be in the stock market, still have access to growth items is a big hallmark of the 10-year highlight. It's also a time to start thinking a little bit about taxes, but we're still a few years out on that. But your primary portfolio job is still growth. So then we get, a few years in, and we've already kind of taken a vision of what the, retirement income looks like. But now we're starting to think about, what are all these other things that might come into play? And so healthcare is a big one at 8 years out, because you can start to think about it and say, all right, I'm going to retire early, or I'm going to retire when I can get Medicare. That's a big decision. So if you retire at 62 and have to cover a 3-year gap until you can get Medicare, healthcare becomes a really big component. And so at 8 years out, you're starting to get a better vision of what that looks like. And so, we work with a lot of people with, in a lot of different fields, but I think a big part of it is having some honest conversations about what you think your healthcare is going to look like. And that can be from, I'm a healthy person, to I'm going to need a lot of healthcare insurance coverage, or whatever it would happen to be. But you're still in your earning years. You're also starting to think a little bit about estate planning, because at 8 years out, I never think it's too early to start estate planning, but that's what I do, right? So, but it is, as you start to look into retirement, we have expected life expectancies that you can start to look at, and those numbers start getting a lot closer than what they were. So having beneficiaries aligned on retirement accounts, having wills in place, having trusts in place, that's, 8 years out, still a pretty good place to take a look at that, because you want those things in place, especially once your income goes away, that where your items are going. From a portfolio standpoint, it's still accumulation phase. You're still putting in money, and potentially because of the way your retirement contributions work. So if you're putting away 10% of your paycheck and your paycheck's going up, these last 8 years are going to be some of the biggest years that you actually put money into your retirement accounts. And so you're still in the accumulation phase. You're still in the growth phase. You're still in areas where you can take risk within the portfolio, less than we were at 10 years, but definitely more than we will be as we get closer and closer. 5 years out, that starts to become, hey, this is getting real. And I think, you've built your retirement income projections at this point, to a much greater extent. You're starting to look at Social Security's. You can go on Social Security's website and they'll tell you exactly how much to predict that you're going to get at 62, 65, 70, whatever age you're planning on retiring. It's also time to start thinking about, once I stop earning, am I going to be able to do Roth conversions? Am I going to be able to do things from a tax perspective that makes sense? But I always use this as a time to look at it and say, well, if the market dropped by 20%, what does that mean for me? Because we're within 5 years. So let's say you've got $1 million portfolio and it drops to $800,000 over the course of a year and you're 5 years out. That's significant. $500,000 drops to $400,000. do I still have time to make that up and get back to break even by the time I retire? And so you still got to have some growth, but we're starting to take some of that growth out of the portfolio so that we have better certainty when we do get to retirement. It's really an evolving thing. You can never time the market. You think about the people who were planning on retiring in 2007, 2008, 2009, and the market drops 50% on you right as you're starting to retire. It took until 2011 to get that back to break even. We've had significant sell-offs since then, but it's been one of these things that most of our sell-offs, COVID, this year with the Iranian war, or other sell-offs, 2022, we've recovered really, really quickly, and that's not always going to be the case. So I've got a big concern that a lot of people will have excess risk in their portfolios just with the assumption that, hey, it'll bounce back super quick. And it might. The structure of our retirement system in the stock market has led to these quick recoveries. But we've also gone through, in not too distant memory, 2008 through 2011. We had the tech bubble in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003 were all bad years. So you've got a lot of history in there of the stock market not playing nice when we need it to play nice. So we're pulling some risk out. The 3-year out mark, I think that this is a pretty good time to start saying, can I live on my projected income? So it's not a bad idea to take a look at your budget at 3 years out and say, all right, if I'm planning on making $80,000 a year in retirement from whatever source that ends up being, rental income, stock market performance, Social Security, or whatever it is, even if I'm making a certain dollar amount that's more than that now, could I live on that dollar amount and live the type of lifestyle that I want to? It's a time to simplify finances. It's a time to eliminate debt where you can. So it might be the type of thing that 3 years out, you accelerate mortgage payments so that hopefully you've paid off your mortgage by the time you get to retirement. That's not true for everybody. A lot of people are going to hit retirement and their mortgage is still a big thing. But especially around here where we've just gone through this tremendous growth in prices on homes, we're going to have a lot of people hitting retirement with still significant mortgages. But that's another one of those reasons behind like that 80% number that I was talking about earlier, in that if we can get that paid off, we can simplify our finances, we can be in a better position. And so 3 years out is a good time for that. Portfolio-wise, I'm taking a lot of risk out at this point. So if I was 100% in stocks at 10 years out, and then at this point, I might be a 60-40 portfolio. And that's a big if, just with the idea that I still need growth, but I want to be able to say that if the market goes down, I'm going to be able to hit my income needs. And if you have other assets outside of it, so that number is a little bit dependent upon what's going on. So let's say you've got an expectation of $80,000 of retirement income per year, and you're getting $30,000 from Social Security. At this point, I'm going to project out. I think right now the average Social Security is around $24,000 a year. But let's say it's around 30, so we've got to cover a gap of 50. Let's say I've got rental income of 10 a year or something like that. Okay, well, now I've got to cover a gap of 40. Well, can I cover 40 per year out of my investments? And we've gone from this system of pension plans to from defined benefit pension plans to defined contribution 401k systems and the like, SEP IRAs, simple IRAs, all the various things. And the rule of thumb on that is 4% of your assets is what you can take out and not worry about touching principal. I think that number is probably, that's the rule of thumb number. It's probably a little low, but that's the safe number. And the thought process would be, is, let's say I've got 500,000 or whatever the number is, but if you're pulling 4% off of that number and I can go earn 4% in a CD, well, my principal value never goes down. And so I can do that for all time and not worry about it. That's not going to be true for everybody. People are going to have to take 6, 7, 8% out, and then we see how long can we make our retirement last. And that's the same thing that was happening with defined benefit plans with pensions. It's just the company was watching their balances change up and down. They had plenty of balances that if one person didn't live as long or one person lived longer, that they could cover it. When it's our own money and we're watching it dwindle from, $1 million to 500,000 to 200,000 to 100,000, that gets scary, and it gets, so at 3 years out, practicing it and basically saying, can I live on a number that, based upon the assets that I do have, is that the lifestyle that I want to live? And that might be at the time where you're like, I thought I was 3 years out from retirement. I could retire right now. Or I'm 3 years out from retirement. I'm actually about 7 years out from retirement because I haven't been able to save, or the market hasn't performed, or whatever it is, or life happened. But the portfolio is definitely preparing for a different type of role than it was. 1 year out, so this is when we start to build out what that first year of retirement income looks like. So we're looking at, of all your investments, we can pull X, and you're going to have Social Security, you're going to have all these other income sources or whatever they happen to be, or I'm going to retire. One of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about is 1 year out. A lot of times that's retirement from my primary job. And so a lot of people retire with the understanding that I'm actually retiring, but I'm going to 1 day a week, with my current job. You'll see that with nurses a lot, and people in the healthcare field, where you can have 1 or 2 day type shifts. Or I'm going to go get another job as a substitute teacher. So a teacher retires, but they become a substitute teacher, so they still have certain amount of income flow. But we're looking at income, we're looking at Medicare enrollment, we're looking at, anything that has to be done with our employer to make sure that when we do retire. So that's a good time to really be in touch with your HR, just so that you know what the schedule is. Because a lot of times, contracts and various things come into play, and you're like, well, I can't actually retire on the date that I wanted to because I had to give 2 months notice or whatever it is. So there's 1 year out, we're really looking at all this planning that we've done. We've got the last items in place that we really need to make sure we're in the right spot, and any changes that we would have to make, we would go for. So then you retire, and then people don't know what to do. That seems to be, we've done, I don't know if anybody's seen them, but we've done a couple of what life looks like in retirement videos. Josh has done a really good job with those. Some of them are all black and white and they look all artsy and cool, and we have to give Josh props even though we don't want to. But that's when all the surprises hit. So 1 year in, we're monitoring it, we're adjusting it, we're trying to figure out what does that actually look like. So a lot of times people will retire and they're like, this is the best thing ever. Other times people are like, I shouldn't have retired. I'm bored. I don't actually like my spouse, or they don't like me, when I'm at home. We were great when we were only seeing each other for about 4 hours a day, but 12 hours a day is a bit much. So we see a lot of people do big adjustments in that first year post-retirement. And it's important that your portfolio can handle that. So one of the things that we'll see, especially for the people who retire early, is a desire to travel and spend a little bit more money on the front end. And there's actually something called the retirement smile, which is something to kind of keep in mind, in that your expenses are higher in your first couple of years of retirement. Then they dip because we settle down. And then when healthcare kicks up, it comes back. So it creates kind of the smile shape of expenditures. And it's definitely one of those things you have to go in with eyes wide open. The example I give a lot of people is, I've had some family members who have medical issues who say, I want to live it up those first couple of years because I'm not expecting to be able to from a, in this case, there was a family member who had significant back injuries, and they're like, I want to travel those first couple of years of retirement because a couple of years after that, I know I'm going to be basically at home and not moving in the same way. So they took out actually like 10% per year for the first couple of years of their retirement with the understanding that I'm going to take like 2% out for a long time after that if I have to. Now the market worked with them and we had 17+% type returns for a period of time there. And so they were able to hit their marks and still have their portfolios increase. But they went in eyes wide open of saying, look, I'm intentionally dwindling my retirement savings because you still want to live life. There's always a math answer to these things, and then there's a life answer. And so you've got to balance those two out. And that's kind of, the thought process in this whole thing is that retirement is this big transition. And it's not only a transition monetarily, it's a transition psychologically, it's a transition potentially geographically. There's a lot of transitions, and so many people think of retirement as the day I hit 65 or the day I hit 67 and I get my watch from my company and I'm retired, right? The people who have the best retirements and the people who have that most success in retirement are the ones who have treated it as a transitionary process starting. Potentially, I could make the argument that my son at 17 should be starting his retirement planning right now, and he'd go, Dad, that's stupid. But the people who plan on the transition, and I would argue, as a kid who's trying to look at college and what sort of career he's going to go in, and then what sort of savings does that equal, if he makes the right decisions now, it makes, by 10 years out, things look easy, and by the time he retires, things are super easy. But I get eye rolls when we talk about it that way. So that's, the thought process of this is that it's all built one step at a time, and kind of that's the main message that I wanted to get across.